Welcome back to The Empire Never Ended with Boris, Fritz, and a very sick Ray. Well, an increasingly sick Ray. As we started recording today, he began to cough, look a little green in the gills, and then now he's recording from the floor of the Bosnian pyramid.
Yeah. So this will be like an ASMR episode, I think.
Yes.
Because if I talk louder, I immediately start coughing. So I will have to sound like this. So
the soothing sound.
Our first ASMR episode.
I think it's sexy.
Yeah,
well,
me too.
It is what it is. It's either this or like violent coughing, which no one.
It seems
wants.
like we've had this
No
effect
one
on before. Like Amanda got sick after doing an episode with us. I mean, like she started coughing.
Yeah.
During
I mean, I actually don't feel that bad. It's just the cough, which is not good when you're recording a podcast.
No, yeah. That's kind of the opposite of what we want.
Yeah. All right. So nothing but soothing tones and
yes.
Well, cool. So welcome back to Tenepod at Night.
Yes.
With smooth Ray Catula.
Ray won't be doing James Mason voice for us tonight.
No. Well, ASMR is kind of a. I think this episode needed a kind of a shtick to it because otherwise, to be honest, it doesn't have a lot in it. I have to say.
That's a great start. Good.
Very encouraging.
Thanks for being here, listeners.
Yeah, I mean, it does actually. I'm joking a little bit, but it is a kind of it's like if you just listen to this episode, you would be like confused about what is actually the point of this episode. But it's actually very important episode for my kind of idea or thesis that I have, and that's that there is a link between the Serbian anti-communist terrorists of the Cold War era and the Black Hand that we talked about. This episode kind of focuses. This episode is the link, basically. So that's the purpose of the episode, and I think that's kind of cool. But I guess I'm a nerd.
Well, it's good that we're whispering in these hushed tones then, because
yes,
the walls have ears. The Black Hand could be anywhere.
Yeah. So, this is a kind of a little national defense series that we have. And this is like the third in a row episode connected to this topic.
That's the Serbian National Defense.
Yes, Serbian National Defense. Originally called just the National Defense, or actually Serbian Defense, as we explained in the first episode, when it was... We talked a little bit about this organization, which was started in the early 20th century, like in 1903 or 4, I think, as basically not even a public organization, just kind of an arm of the Serbian state to organize the insurrection in then Turkey-occupied territories of the Balkans, like Macedonia and Kosovo, and then was transformed in a more public organization called the National Defense, which, changed its forms, and we explained all of that in our last free episode. It's, also, connected to organizing guerrilla fighters, the so-called Chetniks, and closely tied to the secret group society, basically called the Unification or Death or the Black Hand, which I see as a kind of early Serbian deep state, like parallel state center that was also running in some capacity the National Defense Organization and other groups as well, and had people occupying important positions in the Serbian state, and which was like a very, very nationalist Serbian organization, ideologically kind of pure nationalist, as I think I said it already in one of the episodes, like not so necessarily right wing or left wing or monarchist or Republican, just really committed to a kind of creating a bigger Serbia or even Yugoslavia. At that point, these two terms were not really contradictory to each other. They were almost seen as kind of synonymous. And we talked about what these both groups, the smaller Black Hand one and the wider National Defense network, had to do with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and how they were connected and probably instrumental in that. And then we said, well, after the First World War, the national defense kind of continued its existence in the United States. And this is really what we're talking about today.
Yeah, and listeners might remember that I mentioned some stuff about national defense in the episodes that we talked about, specifically the 20s and 30s, the interwar period in the U.S., and then World War II.
Yeah.
Specifically, some of these names that come up, Konstantin Fotić, for example, was very important to the development of the nationalist migrant immigrant groups in the U.S.
Yeah, he was the ambassador of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia to the United States. And very much a part of this group.
And then, of course, when we talked about the free word, and they had, a very long-standing beef that I think we'll probably touch on again later in this episode with the Serbian National Defense.
Yeah.
See, I'm also trying my hardest to sound smooth now.
I guess so, yeah.
We're getting into the vibe.
Yes. So, officially, there was a chapter of the National Defense Organization even in the pre-First World War period, but a proper nationwide organization called the Serbian National Defense, as an offshoot of the original national defense from Serbia, was founded in 1914 in the United States. And the first, so of course that's the year when the First World War started, and primarily the purpose of the group was to kind of rally the American public around, support for Serbia and also the Serbian immigrant community, and to send volunteers to join the Serbian army to fight against the Austro-Hungarian invasion. The first president and leader of the Serbian National Defense in America was a guy called Mihailo Pupin. We mentioned him before with a very unfortunate last name.
Yes.
in America.
Yep.
Mike Pupin.
Yeah, Mike Pupin. And he was born in 1858 and died in 1935. He was a physicist, quite a established, well-known physicist, a Columbia professor. By the Serbs, he's seen as a kind of a lesser Tesla, a kind of an Serbian American scientist. But actually, at the time, he was, I think, in America more established than Tesla was, and kind of better placed in its society, I would say. For example, he was one of the founding members of NASA, basically, or as it was originally called, National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics in 1915. So that's what he started. He started NASA in 1915. In 1914, he started the Serbian National Defense.
Because Tesla at this time, Tesla had his heyday a little bit before this. And by this time, he's already kind of seen as like a weirdo. He made tons of money, blew it all, didn't give a shit about like being rich or famous. Was kind of already, seen as an outcast.
Yeah, Tesla was a
genius.
weirdo, and Pupin was not. He was like a very kind of normal, established gentleman, I would say. And he was an important guy both for Yugoslavia and Serbia and United States. For example, during the First World War, he worked at Columbia University and organized a research group for submarine detection techniques. He was also involved in like telecommunications for submarines and such things. So he was basically doing science stuff for the American military. At the same time, he was a very well-known Serbian nationalist. So in his writings, for example, he refers to the Franz Ferdinand assassination, and he says how it was, for decades in the making, ever since, Austria invaded Bosnia. Basically, it was bound to happen, something like this. That's kind of his analysis. He was also very friendly with Woodrow Wilson, the president, and had a role in establishing the borders of Yugoslavia after the First World War. Through his influence on Wilson and other American politicians. He, for example, claimed, because Pupin was from the Banat region of now Serbia, and then before it became a part of Serbia and Yugoslavia, Hungary, or Austro-Hungary. And he says that when Woodrow Wilson realized that Pupin was from Banat, he then insisted that it becomes a part of Yugoslavia, because it was also claimed by Romania.
Yeah.
He also influenced Wilson to reject the so-called London Agreement of 1915, which is an agreement signed by Italy and the Allies on how to divide some territories that Yugoslavia claimed for itself, like Dalmatia, Istria, and so on. According to the agreement, that was supposed to be a part of Italy, and it was rejected and under some influence of Pupin and then pressure from Woodrow Wilson, at least according to Pupin. So kind of a very influential, important guy. So he really organized a lot of volunteers to be sent to Serbia, and yeah, it was a very important figure in that sense for the Serbian cause, as a very established guy in America supporting it. So after the First World War, not much is known really what was going on with the organization in America. So it is said that it continued to exist, but I think that the one reason why not much is known is because the Serbian National Defense in America that exists now, when they write their history, they kind of skip this part, like the interwar period of their group. And it is said that the organization was kind of dormant or something like this. I think that one of the reasons that it is so is because the organization it adopted the ideology of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, of Yugoslavs as one nation. And this is very inconvenient for the Serbian National Defense that existed, in the Cold War era, that exists now as well, because they rejected Yugoslavia and they kind of equated it with communism. And they were very specific in that sense among the Serbian emigre organizations in their hardcore anti-Yugoslav approach, because there were like Serbian emigres, even like pro-Chetniks groups that still kind of accepted some form of a Yugoslav state existing. But these people were completely against it and thought the whole idea is a Croatian scam against Serbs and so on. So if a group, which is also their group, only a few decades before existed, that kind of championed Yugoslavia, but it was also an anti-communist, nationalist right-wing group, monarchist one. It kind of, it really disrupted this kind of binary ideology that they wanted to establish. Yugoslavia equals communism. So I think for this reason, they almost don't mention it. Like it's very interesting. I will talk a little bit.
I was actually thinking about this after the episode that we did, in which I mentioned that Serbian National Defense restarts again in like 1940, or 41 in the U.S. And I thought it was interesting that both Serbian National Defense and the communists who don't like them also skip over that time period. And I think that this is in large part because, everything that you just said is absolutely true. I think also the general vibe in like immigrant communities in the U.S. was extremely pro-Yugoslav at that time. So like, some of the accounts that I read of guys who even went, heeded the call and went to join like the Serbian or Montenegrin armies during World War One, came back like extremely pro-Yugoslav, to the point that Mirko Marković's, best pal in Hazleton, Montenegrin guy, was, volunteered in World War One. He came back. He was, very pro-Yugoslav, to the point that he became a communist because, he thought that the monarchy had betrayed, like, the ideas of pan-Slavism and, national liberation for the Slavs or whatever. So I'd imagine that, like, if they had tried to continue more or less on that line, they wouldn't have much support outside of certain like weird, clerical circles and the like, which were even then divided, like we talked about.
Yeah. Well, for example, in 1932, the Canadian chapter of the Serbian National Defense changed its name to the Yugoslav Canadian Association.
Right.
So that's and as we'll see, as you said, in 1941, they kind of reestablished the Serbian National Defense in America, and you will see now why that was a very embarrassing history for them.
But also one more thing there too is that I think that a lot of that infrastructure that existed with the Serbian National Defense literally became right, the wing of the Yugoslav monarchy state in the U.S., right? We talked a bit about how monarchist agents were like snitching on potential like subversive people, trying to get them blacklisted from jobs, talking to the FBI, really working that angle. And from what I understand, at least from what I've read, a lot of those people were from those circles, right? Like the original Serbian National Defense in America that would then kind of reestablish themselves in 41. So guys that were affiliated with Fotić and later, Dučić and the like.
Yeah, so Dučić, let's talk about him. Yavan Duches, born in 1871, died in 1943. He's like a famous Serbian poet, but also was a diplomat. I think he became a part of the Serbian diplomat corps in 1907 and continued basically almost until he died to be that. Born in Herzegovina, became a very like staunch Serbian nationalist already while living in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Was particularly agitated by the Austrian control of Bosnia, and interestingly enough, so he's the guy who kind of reestablishes, at least in the official history, the Serbian National Defense in America in 1941 and sets its ideological tone, which exists to this day because the organization still exists. But he is also one of the founders of the original National Defense in 1908 and was very active back then, and is said to be was close politically to the leaders of the Black Hand. So also I will remind you that we don't really know who were all the members of the Black Hand. So it's quite possible that he was also one of them. I mean, he certainly was politically very close to them.
And Dučić, like we mentioned in our World War II episode, when he came to the U.S., he had been previously the ambassador to Francoist Spain. And was seen by most of the Yugoslav American leftists as a Francoist. They called him the Serbian phalangist.
Yeah, very, very right wing. Yeah. So he arrives in 41 to America, and he hooks up with his cousin Michael Dučić, who is an industrialist from Gary, Indiana.
Gary, of course, was one of the biggest, like, specifically Serbian centers in America. In that, like, we talked a lot about some of these different places: Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Detroit. Gary had a lot of Serbs. It was very Serbian place.
It is said that the Serbian community at the time called it Serbian Gary. That was their name for it. So he moves in his cousin's mansion on a lake, and the two of them start planning what to do. So their closest associates at the time is the guy that Boris already mentioned a couple of times, Konstantin Fotić, also a Yugoslav diplomat, aligned with the exiled Yugoslav government in London, but with really much more kind of Serbian chauvinistic politics, less so Yugoslav. And the other important ally is the Serbian Orthodox bishop Dionysia. Dionysia is also kind of an interesting character, very connected to another bishop that we had a whole episode about, that's Nikolai Velimirovich, and was aligned with him since the 1920s, especially to his movement that Nikolai started in Yugoslavia, the movement that we kind of described as, Clero-fascist Jesus freaks, basically.
Yeah.
And that movement was started as a kind of a reaction, an attempt to basically co-opt an autonomous heretical movement that existed at the time in Yugoslavia, which was in many ways not orthodox. But there was some kind of a spontaneous religious energy among the very poor parts of Serbian society, and Nikola Velimirovich was sent as a very kind of authoritarian pro-fascist bishop, really to co-opt it and use that energy for the benefit of the church. And Dionysia was one of his boys at the time. This movement then, under their leadership, also became aligned with the Serbian or Yugoslav fascist movement in the 30s, led by Dimitrije Ljotić, that we also had a few episodes on. It's interesting that Dionysia said that in his youth that he was a heretical himself, that he was a part of some kind of millenarian current, which I found very interesting. Maybe he was like also part of that movement before Nikolai took it for the Orthodox cause. I'm not sure exactly. So these are the people that are, Dučić's allies now.
Dionysia is like a straight up weirdo too. I mean, like he's pretty out there, like, and he gets, I think, increasingly nuts throughout the Cold War.
Yeah,
like motherfucker, he completely loses his mind. I mean, he was crazy when he arrived in 41. I mean, like, seemed to be pretty unpopular with a lot of people when he got to the U.S. But
I will talk a little bit later about the schism that happened in the Serbian church. So maybe at that point you can also add the things about him.
For sure, yeah.
So they're hanging out in this mansion, by the lake in Gary, Indiana, and they decide to restart the American Serbian, the
Serbia National Defense.
Yeah.
In America.
Yeah. So they decide to restart the Serbian National Defense in America. And also what is interesting is that apparently people say that Dučić, when he came to America, he claimed that he was sent there by the Yugoslav government on a special mission. And he never explained to anyone what that mission was. So that's kind of a mysterious thing there going on.
Mm-hmm.
So the refounding conference of the organization was held in Chicago in November of 41. Michael Dučić, his cousin, was elected president. And what is interesting is that so they have like a little program, only a few points, but the first one is how their organization, the Serbian National Defense, stands loyally besides United States and the American Constitution and the president, and will help any action for the defense of America and the defeat of the dictatorial powers, which is an interesting thing to say in 1941, because Serbian National Defense is interesting because they are kind of a Cold War group that exists already in 1941. So this is the era of the anti-fascist coalition, but they are talking about the defeat of the dictatorial powers, and by that I think they also mean Soviet Union.
Oh, they absolutely do. I mean, like I said, there's nobody more maligned in like the free words like articles than the Serbian National Defense. They say these people are explicitly fascists. They have like some more kind of wiggle room and sympathy for the Serbian National Federation. They're like these guys are mostly whatever, there are Chetniks there, it's okay, blah blah blah, they're misguided, but these guys are straight up fascists. They hate Croats. They are like phalangists, as they call them.
And another interesting point in this quite unremarkable program that they have, which is all about defending the Serbian nation, helping the Serbian nation and so on, is that they will aim to acquaint the Serbian people with the democratic principles and virtues and the great culture and economical power of the United States, which again kind of sounds like a Cold War group, but they write this in 1941. So I find it quite interesting.
But I think that's also because they enjoyed quite a bit of support from the U.S. government during World War I, right? Like they got, Serbia was part of the Allies. America, there's the famous, Serbian flag over the White House and like all this other stuff. They had their kind of moment in the sun back then. I think that they got to know and understand pretty well. I mean, probably through Pupin's connections to Woodrow Wilson, like what you got to say to like get like the average American WASP or whatever on your side, which is to talk that talk, which is something that like most emigre community, like most emigre groups and stuff like that only learned in the Cold War period. But I think that because of this very specific relationship that they had, which I don't think very many emigre groups had like enjoyed, that kind of support from the U.S. government, like in World War I, they already kind of knew how to talk the talk and, Right.
So their first Congress was organized in 1942. It was in the monastery, in the Serbian Orthodox monastery in Libertyville, which is, I guess, next to Chicago or like a suburb of it.
A suburb.
Yeah, which is the center of this like Serbian Chetnik movement in America.
Yeah.
They claim they gathered around like 6,000 people for this Congress. The Bishop Dionysia, of course, spoke there. So did, both Dučić and Konstantin Fotić. And they were especially kind of proud that also one of the speakers was a guy called Bliss Lane, who was the last U.S. ambassador in Belgrade before the war started, who came there from Belgrade a year before that, I guess, and spoke, about what's going on in Yugoslavia and, was very supportive of the Chetnik movement at the time. So it's clear that they had kind of their favorites in the U.S. administration, but also people that they hated very much so. And also they have this kind of more Cold War rhetorics when they talk about, philo-communist in the U.S. government at the time and so on. So they, pledge their allegiance to the president, but they are kind of suspicious of FDR, and they straight up hate, for example, Henry Wallace, who they think is just a commie.
If I'm not mistaken, I believe Marković actually attended that Congress.
I will mention he attended something else similar to that in the same place.
Okay, because he did have a funny observation about the monastery in Libertyville, which
what was it?
He was like, this monastery like is kind of shitty. Like he basically was like, their roof's leaking, like they don't have their shit together. It's like it's really crappy, whatever. Like he talks a lot of shit on the fucking monastery before he goes there.
Yeah, that's Mirko Marković that you talked about in the previous episodes.
He's a bunch in previous episodes. The Comintern's man in the U.S. Yeah,
volunteer in the Spanish Civil War, and one of the editors of the Free Word from Pittsburgh, which is the arch enemy of these people.
Yeah,
they really hate them and still do, although it doesn't exist for.
It hasn't existed since 1951.
Yeah,
still hanging on to that beef.
So this same group organized a kind of a larger. This is what you were talking about, a kind of a larger Serbian assembly, which was not just an assembly of their organization, but all of the Serbian groups in the same place. I think this was in 1941, and this was attended by Mirko Marković, who wanted to speak, and he spoke directly to Bishop Dionysia and asked, like, "Can I say something?" And it's kind of interesting because how it's described, like Dionysia doesn't look good because he was kind of, the bishop was confused and didn't know what to say and started stuttering, and then regained his composure and started hysterically yelling at Mirko Marković, like, "You're a communist, get out of here," and so on. And then had to be calmed down by another priest who said, "Yeah, it's fine, you can talk." So Mirko Marković did give his speech. Which also, ties into the thing that we said before, how there was a division between the bishops in the church and just ordinary priests, many of which were anti-fascist and even communist. And the bishops, like Dionysia, were tied to more kind of clero-fascist groups.
Yeah.
So Dučić came with this idea there and really organized the group around the anti-Yugoslav agenda, and that was, and he really used the genocide committed by the Ustasha movement at the time against the Serbs in their, Nazi puppet state to prove his point. And the point was Yugoslavia was like a conspiracy against the Serbs, a Croatian idea, and also Croats kind of inherently hate Serbs to the point of genocide, and Ustashas are the proof of that, and basically all Croats in the end are Ustashas. And so we need to kind of reject the whole Yugoslav idea in any form, even monarchist or whatever. And that's basically the point of their ideology, or one of the points, even now and throughout this whole period, and why they also want to forget some other incarnations of their group, which were very pro-Yugoslav, or at least open to the idea.
Right.
And even, like, for example, Colonel Apis, the leader of the Black Hand, when he was shot in 1917 for trying to kill the King Alexander, before he was shot, he yelled, "Long live Greater Serbia, long live Yugoslavia," for example. So it was You see, for him there was no contradiction there, but for these people there very much is. So they develop very quickly into like a typical primarily anti-communist organization very early on. They're very progressive in that sense. Already in 1941, that's kind of their main thing.
Yeah.
They together with some other groups, they published this newspaper which we mentioned before called the what's it called? The American Serbian Defender, or how do you say it in English?
Yeah, American Serbian Defender.
Yeah.
So they, just real quick about that, that's not their publication. That's the oldest Serbian American newspaper in America. They just had significant connections within the Serbian National Federation, which is the organization that controlled the newspaper.
Well, the thing that I read kind of framed it as that it was jointly run by them and two other groups, let's say. Maybe it was some kind of informal deal. And then they were not satisfied with the amount of control they had in it. So they left it and started in 1952 their own publication called Sloboda or Liberty, which was published both in English and Serbian and was started in Chicago.
Yeah, I mean, Serbian National Defender definitely had like these national defense guys in it, like, but they were also in the SNF, and that's how it worked. Because like, if we talked about this before, there was a lot of effort put into controlling the big umbrella groups, of which the Serbian National Federation was the largest for Serbs, the Croatian Fraternal Union being the largest one for Croats. And like the kind of anti-fascists managed to kind of coup the, more radical right guys out of the Croatian Fraternal Union. The opposite kind of happened in the Serbian National Federation, where these national defense guys kind of managed to have their own guys in there. Also, if you believe Mirko Markovic and everybody else, that's because the monarchy was paying them all tons of money.
Yeah.
To like push like this more radical line.
In 1960, there is a kind of a change of guard there. So Yavan Duches, the poet, he died already in 1943, and I think his cousin died in 1960, and so a new president was elected, and a guy called Dr. Uroš Seferović, who I think came to America after the Second World War, but I'm not completely sure. He was a medical doctor, had a private clinic in Chicago, although I think originally he lived in Detroit and was running one of the more active chapters, or maybe the biggest one of the organization, which was in Detroit, which was also where the Free Word was published, right? So I guess.
No. Free Word was published in Pittsburgh, and then they moved to Chicago at the end of like the 1940s when they got like literally run out of Pittsburgh.
Yeah. So this guy Seferović, in addition to being a medical doctor, he was also a singer of like Serbian folk songs, and there are like recordings of him singing. So you can also put that here if you want.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, he was like a kafana singer of like Serbian folk songs.
I told you that the tamburissins and stuff would not leave this arc. This is going to remain a constant.
Yeah. So he's kind of important here because he was the president of this group, which was one of the most anti-communist Serbian groups in America at the time through most of the Cold War era. It was this guy who was the leader from 1960 to 1985.
Yeah.
And he had a kind of, I guess, ambivalent, to some degree, relationship with the more kind of extreme terrorist people.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a publication that the organization published in 1988 or 89, but the occasion was the 80 years of their organization. So as you see, they claimed the 1908 founding of the National Defense in Serbia as the starting point of their organization.
Mm-hmm.
And in the publication, they almost completely skip the existence of the 1914 version of their group in America. for the reasons that we already mentioned, or I assume are the reasons. And so it's interesting to see this publication as in the way they describe their group and their history. So it's interesting, very much the emphasis on the original 1908 National Defense, and the whole idea of the betrayal by the politicians and how the Serbs were sold, to Croats in a way, or betrayed by Croat traitors. So there's this idea. The narrative is the Serbs fought bravely in the Balkan Wars and in the First World War, and then without any consultation with the people, the politicians in 1914 they set as their war goal the liberation of all the Yugoslavs and the creation of Yugoslavia instead of Greater Serbia. So the Serbian people were kind of swindled there. They also conveniently somehow claim, because it's true that the national defense in Yugoslavia continued to exist to some point, and in 1932 was led by a guy that we mentioned before, a Chetnik guy called Ilija Trifunović Birčanin, and they claim that he was like a very pro-Serb, anti-Yugoslav guy, and this is why he had problems with the Yugoslav kingdom. And this is like not true, because at the same time he was also an important member of the organization that we also had an episode on, which is Orjuna, the organization of Yugoslav Nationalists, the fascist group from the 20s that also had some later incarnations in the 30s, which really was very much behind this idea of a single Yugoslav nation. And he was the kind of the official Chetnik of that, the Chetnik leader of that organization. And in the he was an old Chetnik from the pre-First World War period, the guerrilla warfare in Macedonia and so on. But in the Second World War, he was officially a part of Draža Mihailović, Yugoslav army in the fatherland. In reality, he had his own headquarters in Italian-controlled Split, the city of Split, and was officially, a part of the officially allied to with the Western allies, Draža's Chetniks, but was in reality a part of the Italian occupation system there. And his Chetniks existed legally under Italian occupation as the anti-communist volunteer militia, anti-communist volunteer militia. So, but he's mentioned here just to they completely omit everything that I said, and they just said he's like an old Serbian Chetnik who fused the national defense in the fatherland with Draža's Chetnik movement, and that's like how they say, how the original organization was completely behind the Draža's Chetniks.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
So it's interesting also, one thing that they mentioned there is how they mentioned the generation, they praise a certain Serbian generation as the best, the superior of all generations in Serbian history.
The greatest generation. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And we have one of those here in America.
Yeah. And for them, this is the 1903 generation. And they say that's the generation that, proclaimed Peter Karađorđević to be the Serbian king. They don't mention that's also the generation that killed the previous king. But I think that's kind of what they mean. So it's interesting they mentioned that, that's when the precursors of the Black Hand decided to kill the king and the queen and kind of massacre them and to bring Peter to power. And they say this is the best generation that did that and also was victorious in both of the Balkan Wars and the First World War. And then, this betrayal came and they were kind of sold by the politicians who supported the Croatian cause of Yugoslavia.
Right.
I
take it these guys didn't read the issues of the Croatian Home Defender that were being published like a few miles away from them that was saying that, Yugoslavia was a greater Serbian plot to destroy the Croatian nation.
Yeah, probably not. Well, maybe they did. Maybe they also kind of knew them and drank together. I wouldn't be surprised, especially in their, anti-communist meetings at some point.
I think that might be in the 50s for sure.
Yeah. So they give a short overview of their history, and it's interesting now what they talk about when they talk about the end of the Second World War. So they mention a village in Germany, in Westphalia, which is, they say, the biggest village there, called Ferde, they say. and this was like an SS stronghold. And when the American army came into the village, the SS was there, and they pretended like they're not there. So when the Americans came into the village, they attacked them and shot from the basements of the houses and from the houses, and the Americans had ultimately they were of course victorious there, but they had many casualties. So in order to punish the villagers there, they banished them all from the village. This is what the Serbs say, and they were like forbidden for 20 years. They couldn't come back to their village to live there. So the village was empty, and they say the village was kind of given to the Serbian Chetniks, who were at the time in Germany as displaced persons. So these are people. These people are the ones who are somehow connected to the history of the Serbian National Defense in America, and they were settled there. There was a few thousands of them, and so this village became a kind of a pretty lively Serbian community in a little Serbian town in Germany. A general called Dimitrije Živković established his headquarters there, and he was directly subordinated to the British occupying command in Germany. Interestingly enough, this general was Dimitrije Živković, also the brother of Petar Živković, also a general who, in the 1930s, when King Alexander of Yugoslavia proclaimed a dictatorship, that guy was the leader of the government.
Oh, okay.
And interestingly enough, he was the enemy of the Black Hand, and also the head of a group that was called by the people the White Hand, as the kind of the army officers loyal to the king and against the Black Hand.
Okay.
But a guy obviously, supportive of the authoritarian tendencies of the king. And for example, Dimitri Ljotić was a minister in his government. This was before that started his movement.
Which were called the Silver Hands, of course.
Yeah.
These displaced person camps in Germany and in Austria and other various places from like the end of World War II into the 50s are really kind of fascinating places. I wish there was kind of more written about it, because throughout research for this arc, we get like these weird stories like this, like, this like entire, like, Westphalian village that becomes occupied with Chetniks. There's very similar things that happen with Ustashas and various other collaborations forcing the Ukrainians, whatever. I'm not really going any particular place with that. I'm just very fascinated by that. Would be very interested to like know more about it, like what it looked like.
I was about to mention a few things about that I found interesting. So again, these are just a few notes that I made from Serbian National Defense writing their own history. So I found a few points there that are interesting, like the ones that I just mentioned. And for example, they also mentioned how this village became like also kind of an intellectual center for Serbian immigrants, and they specifically mentioned Dr. Slobodan Drašković as being there. I mean, you mentioned him before. He's like the guy who, I don't know if he was one of the founders, but basically one of the leaders of the John Birch Society, and as such was friend of, what's the name? It's Fritz's favorite guy,
Not Welch.
The funny name guy who went from the John Birch Society to become a white nationalist.
Revelo P. Oliver.
Yes, Revelo P. Oliver.
Yes. Yeah, wow, you found a way to fit Revelo into Arc 4.
Yeah, well, he and Slobodan Drašković were good friends, and they left together the John Birch Society.
Wow. Drašković was like definitely one of the like important figures in like the early John Birch Society. He was like a pretty out there anti-communist, like conspiracy theorist, instrumental in kind of bridging the gap between like the American anti-communist right and these kind of emigre ones. Because he was like an intellectual. He did speak English very well, which a lot of these guys didn't.
He was a guest at William F. Buckley's TV show.
Nuts.
Yeah.
Maybe also just a reminder about Revelo P. Oliver, or maybe for some new listeners who don't know, I guess in very short, Revelo P. Oliver was kind of everywhere in American fascist history for a while, and I probably the most relevant thing to somebody who's new to the show would be that he inspired William Luther Pierce to write the Turner Diaries. In fact, told him that he should do something very much like that, Revolup Oliver having already done a very similar book in the past that it looks like William Luther Pierce largely based his own book on. So that's Drašković's buddy. Crazy.
Yeah, so Drašković was his friend, a friend of Revolup Oliver, but he was also the son of Milorad Drašković, who was the Minister of Interior of Yugoslavia, very, very anti-communist, and because of that was shot by a communist group in 1921 and assassinated, which really made Slobodan Drašković very mad. And he would often mention how his dad was killed by communist bandits. And his dad was also probably a member of the Black Hand.
Yeah. And he had a book that was popular in like English language right-wing circles for a while called Tito Moscow's Trojan Horse. Weird fucking guy.
Yeah. So these people, still writing about their life in this little village, a former SS stronghold, they mention how their life became better when the British decided to give them jobs. So the service that they worked for was called the Civil Mixed Watchman Service, or CMWS. So it's a bit strange because they don't exactly say what they did, but they just kind of superficially describe what this was. Like, it was uniformed service. They wore black uniforms, so they were called blacks because of that. And they say they lived a military life. They were trained in training centers in Osnabrück, and the instructor for the Serbs were Serbs themselves who previously went to more thorough courses. The training was, they say, British style. They lived in barracks for a period of time, and they said that the training was quite tough and long. Like, when you would join this, you had like a 6-week training program, and then you would be occasionally sent for additional training. And they don't really say what they did, but I found this very interesting. Now, these are already late 40s when they're doing this.
Yeah, interesting.
And I also find it interesting that they put this in the history of their group,
Yeah.
It's a kind of a short summary of their group, and there's quite a few paragraphs about this. So at the same time, the Serbian National Defense in America and Bishop Dionysie are organizing to bring Serbs to America from these camps in Europe. So at that point, Bishop Nikolai, the old fascist, joined them as well, and is now part of this effort to bring Serbs from Europe to America. So together, two bishops and the Serbian National Defense, they start a new group which is called the American Serbian Church Committee for Serbian Displaced Persons. And the thing was, from what I understand from this short summary, is that they had to kind of find people in America who would be willing to sign off some affidavits that they would be responsible for specific people who wanted to come to America, and kind of also maybe be financially responsible for them. So this made things very difficult for this process of bringing people there, because there were thousands and thousands of people who wanted to come. And, so what changed things for the better for them, a new option was introduced by the US government of so-called blanket assurances. And this enabled groups to, send these kind of guarantees for hundreds, if not thousands of people at once. Yeah. And which is what the Serbian National Defense then did. Also,
this is a phenomenon. I'm sorry. This is a phenomenon that we're going to talk about, I think, in some upcoming episodes regarding the CIA in Europe and their position towards anti-communist groups, because these kinds of things were done specifically in order to be able to bring the largest amount of people over to the U.S. without any kind of oversight as to what they did during the war.
Yeah.
Because that had kind of already become a problem. And so a lot of these organizations and these policies were put in place specifically by the CIA to bring as many anti-communists into America as possible.
So this is what they write in their own history. So in order to kind of finance this whole project, their leader at the time Michael Duches, agreed to give a loan to the organization. Not to give money. He was like a wealthy industrialist guy, totally supportive of the Serbian cause and these refugees, heroes who were fighting there or whatever. No,
Okay.
he decided to loan to the group that he's the president of $50,000 that then they would give him back. And the organization would give it back to him by charging the people that they would bring back to America. So I think,
nice.
And this is what they write in their own history. And to me, it sounds like they're actually describing like trafficking. No?
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
they're charging people there to bring them in America. So when they had this idea, Dučić went to the two bishops and explained to them what they want to do and how they will organize, shelter, transportation, and also give them jobs. So in order to take money from them, they don't mention interest, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was some interest involved there as well.
Yeah.
And Bishop Nikolai, they say, was like totally relieved. A big weight was lifted from his shoulders that there was a solution for all of these brave people who wanted to come to America.
And that is trafficking.
Yes.
Yes.
I gotta say, the communists were way better about this because they literally smuggled motherfuckers into the U.S.
Of course, yeah.
They just said they had like a dude that like they had all these like Dalmatian guys in like the Yugoslav like sailors organization of America who would just like take a dude off a ship and bring him inside.
Nice.
Definitely weren't charging them for coming to America.
Yeah. Yeah, then garnishing their... Wait, no, that's not the right word. What's the word I'm looking for? When you take money away from somebody's wages?
Yeah, garnishing.
Why? How is that garnishing? That's what you do to a plate when you make it pretty.
Well, I don't know. Someone thought it's a nice word for that. So in 1950 and 51, the U.S. government gave a loan to the Serbian National Defense also for this purpose, to bring people more there. So they gave them $300,000. Also, like the U.S. government established a group to supervise this whole process, not only for Serbs, for everyone who was dealing with these displaced persons after the Second World War and them coming to America. The group was called the Commission for Displaced Persons, I think. And the
CIA front group.
Okay.
Through and through.
So the Serbian National Defense says in their own history how they had especially close and friendly relationships with this group. And like really, they basically say we were great buddies, and they would often visit each other, and how much the commission was very satisfied the Serbian National Defense and often took them as a kind of an example of how a group should work and so on.
So is this the How I Met Your Deep State part where the Black Hand meets the CIA? Is that
I think so, yeah.
the first strong connection?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we're going to get that in some upcoming episodes. It'll be pretty clear.
All right.
So they say they brought 7,000 people this way, and that they mostly became members of the Serbian National Defense, and that this was the basis for, how they say, a nationalist emigration in Serbian emigration in America.
Mm-hmm.
So through CIA and trafficking and probably making money.
Which again, I'm gonna throw this again over and over and over again in this arc, but it is still hilarious to me that like modern Serbian nationalists are like, these guys are fucking awesome. We hate America, and it's like, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
You guys worked with the CIA for decades. Every single hero of yours was like literally just like a little like CIA snitch and stooge.
Yeah.
Yep.
Who are like, we love Daddy America, crush communism.
Eating like sandwiches, in between meetings with CIA instructors together with some ustashas and something like that.
Damn.
Yeah. So an important thing that happened for this whole group and community was the schism that happened in the Serbian church in 1963. And so the Bishop Dionysie, who's super close to the Serbian National Defense, practically one of the leaders of the group, is at the center of this schism. So it's a very interesting story because there was a woman, I guess a young woman, I'm not sure, called Radmila Milentijević, who was the daughter of some royal Yugoslav officer who was close to the bishop. And she came to America, to Chicago, I think in 1961, and he started living on the monastery premises where the bishop was living. So soon enough, there were rumors that they were lovers. And it became a public scandal at some point. The newspapers were writing about it and so on. So later, some of these people would say how she was a provocateur sent by the Yugoslav communist intelligence there and something like this. But, she had like a Chetnik background and obviously was close to him. So the Serbian church in Yugoslavia at that point was kind of upset by these rumors officially. By the way, I mean, I wouldn't completely, I could see her as being sent there by the Yugoslav communist intelligence. They did things like that. It's quite possible.
Having a Chetnik background wouldn't hurt either.
Yes. Yeah. So a kind of a commission of bishops from Yugoslavia was sent to America to have a meeting with Bishop Dionysia to talk about this in, I think, 1963. And they had a good meeting with him, but when they went back home to Yugoslavia, they decided there should be a church trial for the bishop to determine what's the truth here. And so Dionysia immediately publicly attacked them, said they're a bunch of communists working for Tito and so on. So they reacted in a way that they removed him as a bishop. And what Dionysia did is he organized something which is called the Church Popular Assembly, which is an institution that existed throughout early modern Serbian history as a kind of a national institution, when important thing needs to be decided for the Serbian nation. It's like a church-run thing, but it's not only the priests who attend, it's also the layman to decide on an important matter. So what they decided on this occasion is that, the church in Yugoslavia is run by a bunch of fake bishops who work for Tito and are all communists.
Okay.
And we'll start our own anti-communist church, which later would be called the Free Serbian Orthodox Church.
Right.
So this started the schism that was only reconciled in 1992. And I think there are still some maybe hardcore parishes that are still not reconciled.
Yeah, a lot of which are in Australia.
Yeah.
Huh. Okay.
And if I'm not mistaken, this takes us back to our episode about weird lesser Orthodox churches. I believe the Free Serbian Orthodox Church was made an Orthodox church via the Ukrainian bishop in the United States.
Okay.
Which is interesting.
Yeah.
The church that now also in its current form made the Montenegrin Orthodox Church a thing as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, although officially they don't recognize it as a church, but they have some connections with individual priests, I guess.
No, one of the splinter. So, okay, one of the splinter Ukrainian churches gave whatever church authority to the Montenegrin Orthodox Church.
Okay.
Now they have been absorbed into this official Ukrainian Orthodox Church.
Okay, I didn't know that.
So one of these other splinter anti-communist groups also gave the Serbs in the in the 60s their legitimacy through whatever bishop it was who ordained this Dionysia as the head of this patriarch of this separatist church.
Yeah. So Dionysia was not only removed as a bishop in 1964, he was also completely defrocked by the Serbian church. So he died of the church. He was just some bum in America.
Okay.
And this schism led to, a split in the Serbian community, globally, especially, the people who cared about this kind of stuff, the Chetniks and so on. So even the royal family was split. But the Serbian National Defense was mostly kind of firmly on the side of the schismatics because, they were the kind of one of the most hardcore anti-communist groups out there. And this was an anti-communist position to have. We have our own anti-communist church, and the church there is controlled by Tito. So naturally, that's the way they went. Dionysia also, by the way, lost a court case in America against the Serbian Orthodox Church and lost control of his seat there, like the place where he worked as a bishop. So he had to make a new monastery called New Gračanica in a place called Third Lake, Illinois, which was finished in 1948. So now we're coming to the last part of the episode.
But real quick about like that. So we already talked about how the Orthodox Church, the Serbian Orthodox Church, had to build new churches to counter the ones that didn't want to join under that specific, like under like the patriarchate and the bishops and like these kind of rebel priests and the like. So those churches still existed. And then there was a further schism in which people went with Dionysia. So you had basically at certain times almost 3 different Serbian Orthodox churches in the U.S.
Okay.
It gets pretty complicated.
Yeah.
Because like the ones that were like remained independent from the patriarchate, like when the patriarchate came and formed like a Serbian Orthodox Diocese of America, they remained independent throughout all of this. But then there were also the people that split off from there.
Mm-hmm.
That split off from the official church and made like that crazy anti-communist church too. So yeah, you might at a certain time in a certain place have 3 different Serbian Orthodox churches with 3 different patriarchs or 3 different, allegiances.
Damn.
Yeah, pretty crazy.
At some point, there was a kind of a change of generations in the organization in America. But the change came also with a change of style in the sense that some of the younger people were more kind of extreme or more militant. Although some of these changes were initiated by a guy who was from the older generation. So in the end of the episode, I'm just going to say a little bit about this guy who was one of the people who initiated the more militant strain that was later very present in the Serbian National Defense, and the guy who was seen as kind of his successor.
Mm-hmm.
So the first guy is called Andra Launcherith. He was an officer in the Yugoslav Royal Army, and usually in these histories, he's presented as a kind of mysterious commando parachuter type of character. Like it is mentioned that during the Second World War, he spent some time in the Middle East. He was some kind of liaison between the Chetniks and the British Army. Often they would themselves say how he was a British agent. So that's kind of, even if some of these official histories is not really denied. So Andra Launcherith apparently in 1948, he secretly re-entered Yugoslavia in order to start some kind of a underground resistance movement against Titoism, and was immediately, I think, arrested in some garage in Belgrade, like almost the same day when he went there, and spent a lot of time in prison. He was let go in 1962. Now, it's interesting that there is a rumor that he was not just killed by the Yugoslavs because he had a connection with the very powerful guy in the Titoist regime called Aleksandar Ranković, who was the Minister of Interior and, one of the founders and leaders of UDBA, the secret police there. And so this is like Aleksandar Ranković was at some point ousted by Tito for allegedly basically kind of spying on Tito and things like that, which probably, I'm not sure if that was true, but he was a kind of seen as a too powerful guy there, maybe too much of a Soviet style guy when Titoism was trying to move away a little bit from that. Also was kind of seen as a person who was responsible for the anti-Albanian repression in Kosovo in the 1950s and early 1960s. And when he was kind of removed from power, he just lived as a pensioner. And when he died in the 1980s, after Tito, his funeral became a spontaneous nationalist rally. By that point, people saw him as some kind of a martyr, Serbian martyr or something like this. Although there were never really any evidence that he was a Serbian nationalist. That people just kind of made it up, really, that he was.
Well, I think that was largely because of the repression in Kosovo. No?
Yes.
He did have a pretty chauvinistic stance towards Albanians.
Yes.
according to like other members of the Communist Party and communist leadership, right?
True. But what I found kind of puzzling is that these people, like these anti-communist terrorist people, they mention themselves this idea. They actually believe that Rankovic helped this guy not get killed and get out of prison. Which I'm puzzled why would they think or mention that, because I would think that would be kind of compromising for their hero. But anyway, the rationale is that Rankovic actually had some actual sympathies for him because they were both from the same place, from a suburb of Belgrade, and I guess they knew each other or something like this.
Just to give a little context, Rankovic was besides Tito, he was one of the two most powerful people in Yugoslavia at the time, when it was essentially Tito, Karde, and Rankovic, right? Yes. Being this sort of a holy triad of Yugoslavia.
Yes, a very powerful guy until he wasn't. Yeah. And so Andra Launcherith, they let him go. By the way, he's mentioned, and he goes back to Paris and lives there. But he's mentioned when we did an episode on the Serbian Nazi guy called Lazar Prokic. I cited his book, and he mentions Andra Launcherith and meeting him in Paris, by the way. So Andra Launcherith is living in Paris, and he gathers like some old emigres connected, to the royalist regime, and some new ones who are coming, in the early 60s, late 50s, out of Yugoslavia, and are kind of eager to do something against Titoism. And he organizes a meeting in Paris, I think in 63, I think. And they start a secret group that aims to be like a terrorist militant organization fighting against Titoism. And they call it Krmčija, which means the steering wheel. And they explicitly, on the founding meeting, mention Black Hand and how it's supposed to be a kind of a new incarnation of, or at least inspired by the form and purposes of the Black Hand. And what I found even more interesting is that Andra Launcherith was very close to a guy that I briefly mentioned before called Milan Cavrillovich. I mentioned him before because that's the guy who was the member of the Black Hand and then was a government minister later, also a minister in the government in exile in London. He also had a role in the 27th of March coup at the 1940. He was the first Yugoslav, first ambassador of Kingdom Yugoslavia to the USSR. And in the last moment before the German invasion started, attempted to make some kind of a deal with the Soviet Union. So this guy is closely aligned with Andra Launcherith, and Milan Cavrillovich, his papers are held at some university in America, although I think part of them was transferred to Belgrade some years ago. And there is his correspondence there, and a significant part of that correspondence is with Andra Launcherith. And I found that interesting somehow, that this guy had such a close, he was almost a kind of an advisor to this Andra Launcherith, the leader of this new anti-communist Black Hand, let's say, if we can call it like this. So I found that interesting because he's the actual link, a guy from the Black Hand having some kind of a role that I see basically as an advisor, but also a very shady character. I'll talk more about him a little bit in the next premium episode.
Nice.
Okay.
So Andra Launcherith had this idea, that the old generation of Chetniks like him is finished. They cannot be the victors. They lost the war. What we need are new, younger, militant people. And that was his idea for starting this new group. At the first meeting, they decided what is needed is we need to go to America and really start doing things there. So they have a delegate, this priest who recently came from Yugoslavia, Father Kajević, and they send him to America to work on this, to find people to work with their group. When he goes there, he's immediately met by Bishop Dionysia, who welcomes him and, to their milieu there. So if the bishop was aware what his mission was or not, I'm not sure at this point, but maybe in some of the later episodes we'll talk more about that. Occasionally, Andra Launcherith himself leaves Paris and goes to United States and oversees how the networking and forming of the group is going on. What I find also interesting is that some of these people who are involved in this group, they say that in America, like in Chicago, more militant members of the Serbian National Defense at the time already started their own group of this type, which was called the Black Hand. And these two groups, the one started in Paris, who sent a delegate to America, and the already existing Black Hand one in Chicago, united, and they formed a new group, which is called SOPO, or which is short for the Serbian Liberation Movement Fatherland.
Of the Fatherland, yeah.
So this is how the group was started. Like one group inspired explicitly by the Black Hand and other named explicitly after it, who united into a new group and consisting out of more extreme and militant member of the Serbian National Defense, which is originally in Serbia also the group that kind of gave birth to the original Black Hand.
Yeah.
Which, is interesting. So these are type of things that, the Yugoslav state takes very seriously. Yes. So on the 9th of March of 1968, the French police found a mutilated body of Andra Launcherith, who was 55 at the time. He died 5 days prior in his flat. He was killed in his own flat. The police concluded probably by someone who was waiting for him in the flat, although it was a bit mysterious how this happened because the flat was locked. And they were kind of shocked by what they found because he was killed by an axe and his head was literally split in two, and all of the walls and everything in the room was covered in his blood and brain.
Damn.
Yeah.
This kind of thing has definitely we're going to see this over and over again.
Yes.
There's some pretty brutal assassinations.
Yes. Like immediately now I'm going to talk about one which is much worse than this one. So there was so I said, so this is the last guy I'm going to talk about who was one of the leaders of SOPO, the new terrorist group, or you can see it as a kind of a new Black Hand, maybe, that we'll talk in detail during this arc. I'm just giving you a little preview now. So it's a guy called Rakisha Kashikovich, born in 1932, left Yugoslavia in 1955, settled in America in 1957. While living in Yugoslavia, he was like he wrote children's books, and he was like a poet and a writer. So he was an intelligent guy, also quite young, and he became an important leader of anti-communist Serbs in America, affiliated with the Serbian National Defense almost immediately, became one of the leaders of it. As they liked him especially as a kind of an intellectual. He became one of the editors of the Liberty newspaper. According to some, he was also an agent of the CIA. We know for sure that he was the captain in the reserve of the U.S. military, army specifically, and so on. Yeah, he was like a promising guy for the community there, and also very militant, obviously, as one of the leaders of SOPO. So he was also brutally murdered by the Yugoslav intelligence, and this time it was even much worse. So this was in 1977. It happened in Chicago, in actually the headquarters of the Serbian National Defense. He was killed first by the sledgehammer, hit straight to his head, and then was stabbed 64 times. But not only that, he was also murdered together with his stepdaughter, who was 10 years old, and she was killed by 54 stabbings.
Holy shit.
Allegedly her eyes were even stabbed. He was later, obviously celebrated as a martyr and was buried in the yard of the monastery in Libertyville, the same place where the Serbian National Defense was restarted by Dučić in 1941.
This case is particularly controversial now, in that it's one of the very few ones in which Yugoslav Secret Service never really even kind of came close to admitting that they did it, because they did some pretty brutal assassinations. So if you read about this case on the internet, you'll still find some weird conspiracy theories about it.
Yes, there are. Although I think there is no way they would admit they killed a 10-year-old girl by stabbing her 50 times.
Exactly.
Right. I also read. I think we'll talk about that in a future episode a little bit more. But there was a lot of suspicion among the Chetniks in America if some of them were responsible for it.
Exactly. Right.
They have an idea who the killer was. They claim they know, but they also think that Rakisha Kashikovich was betrayed by some of them. So there were some, accusations there going on between them.
Right, because the main conspiracy theory there is whether it was like an internal fight, whether it was actually the Yugoslav Secret Service or whether it was an internal fight between these different Serbian nationalist groups who were, like, decided to, step it up and off, each other. I mean, honestly, it's hard to determine which one is more real.
Yeah.
Because, like, we know that, like, the Yugoslav secret police definitely did use, like, cold weapons in some of their assassinations. Like, even I think, like, some of the Ustashas were, like, also stabbed a bunch of times in their apartments, like, hacked apart, kind of crazy shit.
Yeah, like the leader
but then at the same time, I mean, like, Max Loburic, for example, was...
Some were strangled, like, from the Ljotić movement.
Right. At the same time, the conspiracy theory about it being like other Chetniks and stuff could potentially make sense because of like the amount of the degree of violence and that like maybe there was a certain kind of proximity.
Yeah.
Like in like real hate between them. I don't know. It's hard to tell because it gets the divisions within even like the Serbian nationalist movement get pretty crazy around this time as well.
Yes. So I mean, this was the episode basically. Kind of, I wanted to describe briefly the history of Serbian National Defense and its connection to the terrorist groups that we'll focus on in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll talk in more detail for at least 3 weeks, about what SOPO was doing, and quite colorful characters are associated with it that we'll talk in detail about, but I think not next week, possibly even not the week after that. We'll talk about something else, and then after a week or two, we'll return to this topic.
Because this is Tanapod, and we bounce around a little bit.
Yes.
Not too far.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, so we're in assassination territory.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be a lot of that in the next few months.
All right. All right, so we wanted to close with a song that a listener actually wrote and recorded with his band The Knolls. It's KNOLLS, based out of New York. And he sent us this pretty sick song called Industrial Control Reports that he says was inspired by our episode on America First, particularly James True.
The lyrics were inspired,
Yeah. James True and his paper at the time that he was circulating around the U.S. government and whatnot was called Industrial Control Reports, and this guy made America First Incorporated before the movement began, and he also patented a policeman's truncheon, which was known by a very different name, a very anti-Semitic name. He didn't write this in his patent application, but he sold it as a way to kill Jews when the race riots start. Not just Jews, of course, but it was sold specifically to like silver shirts and shit like that. So this dude made a kick-ass song about it, and we're gonna play it out.
Yes, it's awesome, man. Thank you so much for doing that.
Yeah, that's awesome. I am very consistently impressed by different listeners that send us things. I wanted to give a shout out to our other listener who sent us pictures from the Serbian Montenegrin graveyard in Hazleton, Pennsylvania.
Oh, yeah.
That was fucking awesome. We are very bad at like internet social media. Otherwise, I think we can still share those photos. But I'm very pleased that y'all are out there listening and writing songs and going to
making
cemeteries of very obscure figures from the Balkan American community.
Yeah. So here we go. This is The Knolls Industrial Control Reports. We'll post a link to the SoundCloud in the episode description.
All right.
Later.
Bye.